All right, let's dive into a huge question, one that sits right at the heart of Indian civilization. Are the great epics, the Ramayana and then the Mahabharata, actual history, or are they just incredible mythology? Now, look, we're not going to give you a final yes or no answer today. Instead, we're going to explore a really fascinating scholarly argument that looks at these stories in a totally different way, as a kind of fragmented, remembered history.
Yeah, I know what you're probably thinking. Stories packed with multi-headed demons, flying chariots, and weapons that can literally wipe out entire armies? How on earth could that be history? It just screams fantasy, doesn't it? Well, the argument we're looking at today asks us to just put that first reaction on pause for a second. It poses this really cool question. What if these epics aren't just made-up stories? What if they're actually the echoes of real events, kept alive for centuries through oral poetry before they were ever written down? What if we've just been trying to read them with the wrong toolkit?
Now, before we can really dig into that idea, we have to understand the powerful objections. I mean, there are some very good reasons why most modern historians are pretty skeptical. We can think of them as three huge walls standing between the world of the epics and what we call verifiable history. So wall number one is about the texts themselves. They seem to be written down way too late to be reliable. Wall number two is the missing evidence. Archaeology just hasn't turned up what the poems describe. And the third wall is this basic problem of method. The epics are just full of magic and miracles, not the kind of stuff sober history is made of. Let's really look at that first wall. The main argument here is that the Ramayana and Mahabharata were put into writing hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years after the event supposedly happened. And that huge time gap, it feels like a total deal breaker for a historian. How could any accurate memory possibly survive that long? Then you've got the second wall, the lack of physical proof. I mean, archaeologists have dug at the sites mentioned in the epics, places like Ayodhya or Hastinapura, and they just haven't found these massive golden palaces. There are no stone inscriptions from that time that say, King Rama was here or Lord Krishna did this. The ground, for all intents and purposes, is silent. And finally, there's that third wall. Even if you manage to get past the first two, you're still left with the content of the stories themselves. Divine interventions, magical weapons, talking animals. Plus, the two epics sometimes seem to contradict each other. For a modern historian, this just doesn't look, walk, or talk like a real historical source. So those are the walls. And they seem pretty high, right? Pretty solid. But the argument we're exploring today says we've just got the wrong keys. It suggests that if we stop trying to use modern tools and instead use keys that are forged from an ancient point of view, well, those walls start to look a lot less like barriers. And the master key here is to avoid what's called a category error. The source argues that demanding modern bureaucratic-style evidence, like written records, from a pre-literate oral society is a huge mistake. It's like judging a beautiful poem using the standards of an Excel spreadsheet. They're just totally different categories of information. This tackles that first wall, the time gap, head on. A gap of a few centuries between an event and when it was written down isn't weird for the ancient world. It's completely normal. You see it with Homer's Iliad, with early biblical texts, with Chinese chronicles. They all have these big gaps. So the Indian epics aren't some strange exception. They actually fit the pattern perfectly. So what about that missing evidence? Well, the source says this is just another category error. We expect to find stone inscriptions, but back in the early Iron Age in India, we're talking around 1200 to 800 BCE, memory wasn't carved in stone. It was preserved orally, in things like genealogies. We expect to find huge stone palaces, but archaeology shows us that the elite centers back then were much more modest, so the absence of evidence is actually exactly what we should expect to find. And this idea of poetic inflation is just brilliant. The argument isn't that the huge golden city of Ayodhya existed exactly like it's described. No. The idea is that a real, much more modest town existed. And over hundreds of years of retelling the story, the poets, well, they spiced it up. They embellished it, making it grander, more glorious. So the epic description isn't an invention out of thin air. It's an exaggeration of a real place. Right. So what about all the gods and magic? This is the crucial part. The argument goes that the supernatural was basically the language of causality for the ancient world. It's just how they explained why things happened. If you treat all that stuff as a kind of framing device and look at what's actually inside the frame, you find this surprisingly coherent core of real-world politics, real geography, and very human conflicts. And the contradictions? This is where the argument gets really clever. It flips that whole objection on its head.
It basically says, look, if the two epics were perfectly consistent, that would actually be suspicious. It would suggest one author just made the whole thing up. The very fact that they're different suggests they are two separate, authentic traditions, each remembering a different major event. The Ramayana remembers a time of frontier expansion, while the Mahabharata remembers a devastating civil war and the collapse of a whole political system.
Okay, so if we use these ancient keys and we peel back all those layers of poetic exaggeration and mythological framing, what's actually left? What kind of history does the source claim we can really see? First off, it is really important to understand that this framework isn't about blind faith or some kind of nationalist agenda. The source is super clear that it's applying the same critical standards that historians use for Homer's Greece or the world of the Bible. It accepts that there is a lot of uncertainty and tons of later additions. The goal isn't to prove every single detail is literally true, it's to find a plausible historical core. And that core is anchored to a very specific time and place. This isn't some vague, mythical, once upon a time. No, the argument grounds the events of the epics firmly in the early Iron Age of India, a real, archaeologically recognized period between roughly 1200 and 800 BCE. And here's what that historical core looks like. It's not some day-by-day chronicle, but a collection of really powerful memories. Memories of societies pushing into new lands, and memories of a massive war that led to the collapse of an entire political order. And these memories are tied to real geography, they reflect political structures that are totally plausible for that time period, and they contain these genealogies that seem to preserve authentic family lineages. And that brings us to the powerful conclusion from the source material, that the great Indian epics aren't myths in the sense that they're fiction. They are remembered history, the echoes of real events from the early Iron Age, which were then poetically expanded and passed down for 1,000 years before they were finally written down. And in the end, this leaves us with a really profound question, one that goes way beyond just these two texts. It's not just about whether the epics are true or false. It's about how we should listen to the voices and the memories of the ancient world. Do we just dismiss them when they don't speak our modern language of history? Or should we maybe try to learn how to understand them on their own terms?